Rain fell upon London like a shroud that autumn evening in 1847, turning the cobblestones of Whitechapel into mirrors that reflected nothing but darkness and despair. The auction house stood wedged between a gin palace and a pawnbroker's shop, its windows foggy with the breath of too many desperate souls crowded into too small a space, and the air inside hung thick with the mingled scents of unwashed bodies, cheap tobacco, and something more insidious, the acrid tang of human misery made commodity. Elara Ashworth stood upon the raised platform at the front of the room, her hands folded before her with a composure that had taken 2 years and 3 sales to perfect. Her dark hair pulled severely back from a face that had once been called lovely, but now bore the hollowed marks of exhaustion and resignation. She was 23 years old, though she felt ancient, worn thin like a coin passed through too many grasping hands, and as the auctioneer droned through the particulars of her situation, healthy young woman, literate, suitable for domestic service or factory work, sold to satisfy debts of £300 incurred by her father, the late gentleman Albert Ashworth, she found herself retreating into that quiet place within her mind where shame could not quite reach. The crowd before her consisted primarily of men whose eyes crawled over her with varying degrees of avarice and cruelty, merchants calculating her worth in labor, factory owners measuring her frame for endurance, and others whose intentions she refused to contemplate too closely. This was the 3rd time she had stood upon such a block, the 3rd time she had been reduced to inventory, to flesh measured against coin, and the numbness that had settled over her heart felt almost like mercy. She remembered the first sale with terrible clarity, her father weeping as the factory owner led her away, his gambling debts finally exceeding even his capacity for self-delusion, his tears mixing with rain, much like tonight's downpour, and the second sale 18 months later, when that same factory owner, having worked her nearly to collapse, sold her contract to a shipping merchant who treated her as little more than unpaid housemaid. Now her father was dead 3 weeks past, drowned in drink and despair, and she stood here again because his final debts demanded final payment. The auctioneer's voice rose, calling for bids, and the sum began low, insultingly so, creeping upward in miserly increments, as various men calculated exactly how little they might pay for a woman's life. Then a voice cut through the dingy atmosphere like a blade through silk, commanding and cold, emanating from the shadows near the back of the room where the gaslight barely reached. £5,000. The room fell into shocked silence, every head turning toward the darkness from which that impossible sum had emerged, and even the auctioneer stammered into stillness, for such an amount exceeded reason, exceeded all the debts and all the previous bids combined by such magnitude that it seemed almost a mockery. Elara's heart, which had learned not to hope, nevertheless stuttered in her chest as a figure emerged from the shadows, a tall man in an impeccably cut black coat, his face angular and severe, his grey eyes holding all the warmth of a winter storm. She knew him by reputation, though they had never met. Adrian Blackwell, the Duke of Ravenscroft, wealthiest peer in England, a man rumoured to be as cold as he was rich, a recluse who rarely appeared in society, and never, ever involved himself in the sordid business of debt auctions. Yet here he stood, regarding her with an expression she could not decipher, and when the auctioneer finally recovered enough to ask if there were any counterbids, the silence stretched long and terrible until the gavel fell with dreadful finality. "Sold," the auctioneer declared, and Elara felt terror and dark curiosity war within her chest as the Duke approached to complete the transaction, his face revealing nothing, his voice betraying no hint of his intentions as he signed the papers that made her, once again, property rather than person. She had been sold 3 times now, and as the Duke's carriage waited outside in the rain-soaked night, she could not help but wonder what fresh horror awaited her in the house of the coldest man in England, what price this impossible rescue would ultimately demand. The carriage that waited outside the auction house was as black as the night itself, its lacquered surface gleaming wetly in the gaslight, and as Elara climbed inside with trembling hands, she found herself seated across from the Duke of Ravenscroft in a space that suddenly felt impossibly intimate, despite the generous proportions of the vehicle. Adrian Blackwell settled into the opposite seat with the contained grace of a man accustomed to command, his face falling into shadow as the carriage lurched into motion, and through the fog-shrouded streets of London they travelled in silence, broken only by the rhythmic clatter of hooves on cobblestones and the distant sounds of the city settling into its restless sleep. Ilara kept her gaze fixed on her folded hands, her mind racing through memories she had tried so hard to bury the first time, when the factory owner had purchased her contract and led her to that hellish place of deafening machinery and air thick with cotton dust, where she had worked 16-hour days until her hands bled and her lungs burned, where sleep had been a luxury measured in stolen minutes, and food had been thin gruel that never quite filled the gnawing emptiness in her stomach. She remembered collapsing finally, her body simply refusing to continue, and how the factory owner had sold her contract in disgust to recoup his losses, calling her weak, worthless, a poor investment. The merchant who had bought her second had been different in method but not in essence, treating her as unpaid housemaid, working her from dawn until long past midnight, expecting perfection in every task, while providing barely enough to sustain life, and she had endured 18 months of that particular hell before her father's death, and debts had brought her back to the auction block once more. Now she sat across from a man whose wealth could have purchased 1,000 women like her, whose reputation painted him as cold and unapproachable, and she steeled herself for whatever fresh horror awaited her in his household, trying to imagine what service he would demand, what price this impossible rescue would ultimately extract. The Duke had not spoken since they entered the carriage, his face obscured by shadow, and the silence stretched until Ilara felt it would suffocate her. But then his voice emerged from the darkness, being low and surprisingly gentle, carrying none of the cruelty she had learned to expect. "You will not be harmed," he said, and the words were so unexpected, so utterly at odds with everything she had prepared herself to endure, that she looked up sharply, searching his shadowed features for signs of mockery or deception, finding only an expression she could not quite interpret, something that might have been sincerity or might have been elaborate cruelty waiting to reveal itself. The carriage turned onto a wide boulevard, and gradually the squalor of Whitechapel gave way to the elegant facades of Mayfair, then beyond, into an area of vast estates set back from the road behind high walls and iron gates, and when they finally stopped, Ilara glimpsed through the window a house that seemed to rise out of the darkness like something from a Gothic dream, all sharp angles and looming towers, its windows dark save for a few scattered lights that burned like watchful eyes. The Duke descended first and offered his hand to help her down, a gesture of courtesy that felt almost absurd, given that he had just purchased her like livestock. Yet she took it because refusal seemed more dangerous than acceptance, and as her feet touched the gravel drive, she looked up at Ravenscroft House with a mixture of dread and exhausted resignation. The front door opened before they reached it, revealing a woman of perhaps 60 years, severely dressed in black bombazine, her grey hair pulled back in a ruthless bun, her face composed in lines that suggested long practice at maintaining propriety, and the Duke addressed her with formal courtesy. "Mrs. Weatherby, this is Miss Ashworth. Please see that she has given the blue room and everything she requires." The housekeeper's eyes, shrewd and assessing, swept over Ilara with an expression that was not unkind, merely evaluating, and she nodded. "Of course, Your Grace. Come along, Miss Ashworth." Ilara followed the older woman into a grand entrance hall, up a sweeping staircase, through corridors lined with portraits of stern-faced ancestors, until they reached a door that opened onto a room so beautiful it made her breath catch, a spacious chamber, with walls papered in soft blue silk, a four-poster bed with pristine linens, a writing desk positioned near windows that would surely flood the room with light come morning, and most astonishing of all, a small fireplace where flames already crackled warmly. "There's a bath being drawn for you," Mrs. Weatherby said, her voice brisk but not unkind, "and I'll have supper sent up. The Duke has instructed that you are to rest and recover. We'll discuss household arrangements in the morning." She left before Ilara could formulate a response, and alone, finally in this room that felt impossibly luxurious, after 2 years of sleeping on thin pallets in cramped quarters, Ilara sank onto the edge of the bed and tried to comprehend what manner of trap she had fallen into now, for surely no one offered such comfort without expecting something far more terrible in return. Morning light flooded the blue room with a gentleness that felt almost like forgiveness, and Ilara awakened slowly from the first uninterrupted sleep she had known in 2 years, her body sinking into the feather mattress with a comfort that felt dangerously seductive, and for several disoriented moments, she could not quite remember where she was or how she had come to be, in a room that smelled of lavender and beeswax rather than sweat and desperation. Memory returned gradually: the auction, the Duke's impossible bid, the carriage ride through fog-shrouded streets, this room that seemed too beautiful to be real, and with memory came the familiar tension of waiting for the other shoe to drop, for the true price of last night's mercy to reveal itself. She rose and washed using the basin of clean water that had been left for her, then dressed in the simple grey dress that Mrs. Weatherby had provided, noting with some surprise that it fit well and was made of good quality fabric, not the rough homespun she had grown accustomed to wearing. When she emerged cautiously into the corridor, uncertain whether she should seek the housekeeper or wait to be summoned, she found a housemaid waiting, who bobbed a curtsy, an actual curtsy, as though Elara were someone deserving of such respect, and led her downstairs to a small breakfast room, where sunlight streamed through tall windows and a sideboard held more food than Elara had seen in months. Mrs. Weatherby appeared as Elara stood frozen in the doorway, overwhelmed by the abundance, and the housekeeper's voice carried that same brisk kindness from the previous night as she gestured toward the table. "His Grace has instructed that you are to eat properly and rest as long as you require. There are no duties expected of you, Miss Ashworth. You are to recover your strength and, when you feel ready, you may choose what occupation suits you within the household, or you may choose none at all." The words made no sense, contradicted everything Elara understood about the world and her place in it, and suspicion warred with desperate hope in her chest as she searched Mrs. Weatherby's face for signs of mockery or hidden cruelty, finding only patient expectation. "I don't understand," Elara said finally, her voice hoarse from disuse. "The Duke purchased my contract. Surely he expects some service in return." Mrs. Weatherby's expression softened almost imperceptibly. "His Grace's expectations are not what you might imagine, Miss Ashworth. I suggest you eat, explore the house if you wish, and rest. All will become clear in time." Left alone with food she hardly dared touch, and questions that multiplied like shadows, Elara ate slowly, each bite tasting of confusion and fear that this kindness was merely the prelude to something worse, for no man spent £5,000 without expecting return on his investment. After breakfast, driven by restless uncertainty, she began to explore Ravenscroft House, moving through corridors lined with portraits of stern ancestors and rooms filled with furniture draped in Holland covers, evidence of a household that had once entertained but now stood largely empty, until she discovered a pair of double doors that opened onto a library so vast it stole her breath, floor-to-ceiling shelves, laden with thousands of volumes, tall windows flooding the space with light, leather chairs positioned near a massive fireplace, and the scent of old paper and binding glue that had been her greatest comfort in childhood. She was standing transfixed in the center of the room, her fingers trailing over a nearby shelf, when footsteps sounded in the corridor, and she turned to see the Duke of Ravenscroft himself pause in the doorway, and in the clear light of day she could see that he was younger than she had imagined, perhaps 30 at most, his face aristocratic and handsome in a severe way, but his grey eyes held a haunted quality that spoke of sorrows carefully contained, and something in his expression shifted when he saw her there among his books, as though he had not expected to encounter her or was surprised to find her in this particular room. They regarded each other across the expanse of polished floor, the moment stretching into awkwardness, until he spoke with formal courtesy that somehow emphasized the vast distance between their stations. "Miss Ashworth, I trust you slept well." "Yes, Your Grace." "Thank you." Her voice emerged steadier than she felt. He moved into the room, not approaching her directly but angling toward his desk near the windows, and his next words were delivered without looking at her, as though he found it easier to speak such things to the air than to her face. "This house requires no debts be repaid, Miss Ashworth. You are free to occupy yourself as you see fit, or not at all. I ask only that you allow yourself time to recover from your recent ordeals." The statement hung between them, impossible and too good to be true, and Elara felt tears prick her eyes even as her mind rejected the possibility that anyone could be so generous without hidden motive. But before she could formulate a response, the Duke had already turned back toward the door, leaving her alone in the library with questions that had no answers and the dangerous, fragile beginning of something that might have been hope. Weeks passed in a surreal quiet that felt almost like walking through a dream from which Ilara expected to awaken at any moment, and gradually she fell into a pattern that seemed impossibly gentle, rising each morning to find breakfast waiting, spending her days in the library where she had begun, tentatively at first and then with growing confidence, to organize the thousands of volumes that lined the shelves, cataloguing them according to subject and author in a system that satisfied something deep within her that had long been starved of intellectual engagement. The work fed a part of herself she had thought dead, that girl who had once sat in her father's study before everything fell apart, reading poetry and philosophy, while her mother embroidered by the window and the world still held the promise of beauty rather than betrayal. And sometimes, as she ran her fingers over the spines of books she had not touched in years, she would remember that earlier version of herself, Ilara Ashworth, gentleman's daughter, educated and cherished, whose mother had died of fever when she was 15, and whose father had descended slowly into the hell of gambling addiction, transforming from the kind man who had taught her Latin into a hollow-eyed stranger who disappeared for days at a time and returned with pockets empty and eyes full of shame. She remembered the first sale with a clarity that still had the power to steal her breath, standing on that auction block 3 years ago, barely 20, her father weeping as he signed the papers, his hands shaking so badly he could hardly hold the pen, and the factory owner who had purchased her had looked at her with cold assessment as though she were livestock, and she had learned in those first terrible months what it meant to be property rather than person, to have no voice, no choice, no hope of anything beyond survival. Mrs. Weatherby, in her careful way, began to share fragments of information about the Duke as the weeks turned to months, revealing during their occasional conversations over tea that Adrian Blackwell had inherited his title at 23, after a tragedy that had devastated the family, that he lived like a ghost in his own house, that he had never entertained since taking the title, that he worked ceaselessly on matters of estate management and investments as though trying to outrun some private demon. Ilara began to notice the pattern herself, glimpsing him through doorways as she moved through the house, always alone, always surrounded by papers and ledgers, his meals brought to his study and often left untouched, his face drawn with exhaustion that spoke of sleepless nights and relentless self-punishment, and she recognized in his isolation something that mirrored her own brokenness. Two people existing rather than living, going through the motions of days without truly inhabiting them. She would watch him sometimes from the library doorway when he passed in the corridor, this man who had spent a fortune to purchase her freedom and then asked nothing in return, and she wondered what sorrow had carved those lines around his eyes, what guilt drove him to work until he could barely stand, what loss had transformed him into this austere figure who moved through his own house, like a stranger passing through rooms that held only ghosts and memories too painful to face. Late autumn evening arrived, with the particular quiet that settles over great houses when the servants have retired, and the world beyond the windows has faded into darkness, and Ilara found herself drawn to the library, as had become her custom, seeking the comfort of books and solitude after another day spent cataloguing volumes and trying not to think too much about the strange limbo of her existence in this house, where she was neither servant nor guest, but something undefined, that left her perpetually uncertain of her place. She pushed open the library door, expecting the familiar emptiness, and instead found the Duke slumped over his desk near the windows, his head resting on his folded arms atop what appeared to be architectural drawings, the single lamp burning low beside him, casting shadows across his dark hair and the elegant lines of his profile, and something about the vulnerability of finding him this way, unguarded, exhausted, human rather than the austere figure who moved through the house like a spectre, made her pause in the doorway, her heart doing something complicated in her chest. For a long moment, she simply watched him sleep, noting the dark circles beneath his eyes visible even in the lamplight, the tension that lingered in his shoulders even in rest, the ink stains on his fingers that spoke of hours spent working, and she thought how lonely he looked, how isolated in his self-imposed exile, before the impropriety of watching him sleep overcame her hesitation, and she moved quietly across the room, her hand hovering uncertainly over his shoulder before she touched him gently and spoke his name with careful formality. "Your Grace, forgive me, but you'll strain your neck sleeping thus." He woke with a start, disoriented for a moment, before his grey eyes focused on her face, and something like embarrassment crossed his features as he straightened, on one hand moving to massage the back of his neck, where sleeping on the desk had clearly left him stiff. "Miss Ashworth, forgive me, I did not mean to." He trailed off, seeming unsure how to finish the sentence, and an awkward silence stretched between them until he gestured vaguely at the papers before him. "I was reviewing plans for housing development in Southwark and must have lost track of the hour." Their first real conversation began tentatively, formally, as he asked about her cataloguing work, and she explained with growing confidence the system she had devised, organizing his vast collection by subject and chronology, and she saw genuine interest kindle in his eyes as she spoke of finding first editions of Milton and a beautiful illuminated manuscript tucked away on a forgotten shelf. "Do you read, Miss Ashworth?" he asked, and there was something almost unwilling in the question, as though he both wanted and feared to know the answer. "Or do you merely organize?" The question struck something deep within her, touching the part of herself she had thought lost forever, and her answer emerged with more emotion than she intended, as she told him of her childhood love of literature, her mother teaching her to read before she was 5, her father's study where she had spent countless hours with poetry and philosophy until everything fell apart. She saw something shift in his expression as she spoke, recognition perhaps, or understanding, as though he suddenly saw, not the woman he had purchased from an auction block, but a kindred spirit trapped by circumstance, someone who understood what it meant to have lost the world that once defined you. And for a moment, the distance between their stations seemed to dissolve in the shared understanding of grief and loss. "You were educated," he said quietly, and it was not quite a question. "I was, before circumstances intervened." The conversation should have ended there, propriety demanding that he dismiss her and return to his work, but instead they remained talking in the lamplight until he seemed to remember suddenly where they were and who they were to each other, and he stood abruptly, thanking her for waking him with a formality that felt like a wall being rebuilt between them. Yet, as she left the library and made her way to her room, Elara knew that something had changed, that the barrier between them had cracked just enough to let through the first fragile light of understanding. As winter settled over London with its particular grey melancholy, bringing early darkness and frost that etched delicate patterns on the windows of Ravenscroft House, something subtle began to shift in the unspoken space between the Duke and Elara, manifesting first in small gestures that felt almost like messages written in a language neither dared speak aloud. She would arrive at the library in the morning to find a volume of Wordsworth's poetry placed carefully on her desk, its spine showing wear that suggested it had been read many times, and though no note accompanied it, she understood the intention behind the offering and felt something warm unfold in her chest at the thought of him selecting it deliberately, imagining her reading it, wanting to share something of himself through the pages. She began leaving her own responses in the form of careful observations written on bookmarks, slipped between pages, thoughtful commentary on particular passages that had moved her, literary analysis that revealed the workings of her mind, and an unspoken dialogue developed between them through these marginalia and shared texts, a conversation conducted in the safe distance of written words, where vulnerability felt less dangerous than face-to-face confession. Meanwhile, she could not help but observe the patterns of his existence as their paths crossed in corridors and doorways. He ate little, she noticed. His meals often returned to the kitchen barely touched, and he slept even less, judging by the lamplight she saw burning in his study window at all hours of the night, and he drove himself with relentless intensity that spoke of someone trying to outrun demons that pursued him even in his own house. Mrs. Weatherby confided one afternoon over tea that Elara's presence had changed something in the Duke, that he seemed less haunted somehow, though still distant, that the housekeeper had noticed him pause sometimes outside the library door, as though gathering courage to enter before thinking better of it, and walking away. And Elara felt her heart ache at the image of him standing alone in hallways, wanting connection but unable to reach for it. Small kindnesses accumulated like snow gathering on windowsills, each gesture small enough to seem insignificant, yet together forming something that felt almost like tenderness. He ensured the library fire stayed lit throughout the day for her comfort, even though it meant instructing the servants to tend it more frequently, and she began organizing his chaotic study while he was out managing estate business, sorting his papers and architectural drawings into some semblance of order, and neither of them acknowledged these acts directly, as though speaking of them would break whatever fragile thing was forming between them. She would find books on subjects she had mentioned in passing, volumes on poetry or philosophy or history, and he would discover his study transformed from chaos into calm efficiency, his important documents filed where he could actually locate them, his inkwells filled, his desk cleared of the clutter that had accumulated from months of neglect. And through these silent acts of care they spoke to each other in ways that formal conversation could not accommodate, building a bridge between their isolated worlds, one careful gesture at a time, neither daring to acknowledge what they were truly building or where it might lead, but both drawn forward by something that felt like the first tentative hope either had experienced in years of darkness. December arrived with snow that transformed London into something hushed and mysterious, muffling the usual cacophony of the city beneath a blanket of white that made even the grimy streets look almost beautiful in the pale winter light. And it was during one of her solitary explorations of Ravenscroft House that Ilara discovered the abandoned winter garden tucked away at the eastern edge of the estate, a glass conservatory that must have been magnificent once but now stood neglected, its panes clouded with years of grime, its interior filled with the skeletal remains of plants that had long since withered and died, their dried stems and leaves creating a landscape of beautiful desolation that spoke of care once given and then withdrawn. She found herself drawn to this forgotten space, returning day after day with tools borrowed quietly from the gardener's shed, and she began the slow work of restoration, without quite understanding why it mattered so much to her. Clearing away the dead growth, washing the glass panes until light could stream through properly, testing the soil, and discovering that beneath the surface of neglect lay earth still capable of nurturing life. There was something deeply satisfying in the work, in using her hands to create something rather than simply organizing what already existed, and she lost herself in the simple rhythms of tending and planting, finding purpose in the act of coaxing life from what had seemed irretrievably dead, and she did not ask permission because some instinct told her this needed to remain private, secret, hers alone until it was ready to be shared. The Duke found her there on a grey December afternoon when snow was falling in soft, persistent flakes beyond the glass walls, and she was so absorbed in her work, hands dirty with soil, her dress practical rather than fine, her hair escaping its pins that she did not hear him enter, did not know he was there until his voice broke through her concentration with a question that held equal parts surprise and something else she could not quite name. "What are you doing?" She turned to find him standing in the doorway, his expression unreadable, but his grey eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her suddenly aware of how she must look, disheveled and undignified, and she felt the familiar fear rise in her throat as she stammered an explanation. "I should have asked permission, Your Grace. I know. But I found this place abandoned and thought, perhaps." He moved into the conservatory, his careful footsteps bringing him closer as his gaze swept across the space she had already begun to transform, taking in the cleared pathways and the freshly turned soil, the few hardy plants she had coaxed back to life, and when he spoke again, his voice held a gentleness that made her breath catch. "Consider it granted." Then, to her complete astonishment, he knelt beside her in the dirt, his fine clothes heedless of the soil as he asked what needed to be done, and their first truly collaborative work began in that glass-walled sanctuary with snow falling silently around them, conversation flowing more naturally than it ever had before as they worked side by side, and he spoke briefly of his sister Charlotte, who had loved gardens, who had died at 17 with so much life still unlived, and Ilara found herself sharing fragments of her mother's memory in return, the woman who had taught her that growing things was a kind of hope, a belief in future bloom. And grief recognized grief in that quiet space, understanding passing between them without need for elaborate explanation. The afternoon faded into evening, the light shifting from grey to deeper grey, and neither of them wished to leave this place they were creating together, this evidence that dead things might live again with patient care, and there was a moment when their hands reached for the same tool and touched instead, a moment when their eyes met and held with something unspoken trembling in the air between them, before propriety reasserted itself and they drew apart. But the connection had been made, fragile as new growth but undeniably real. And as Ilara returned to her room that night, with dirt still beneath her fingernails and her heart beating strangely in her chest, she understood that something fundamental had shifted, that the careful distance they had maintained was beginning to crumble like frost beneath the first hint of sun. Christmas approached with its particular weight of memory and expectation, transforming Ravenscroft House into something that seemed almost festive, despite the Duke's well-known indifference to holidays, and the servants moved through their preparations with a careful cheerfulness that felt both hopeful and tentative, as though uncertain whether their efforts would be welcomed or merely tolerated by the master, who had spent 5 consecutive Christmases buried in work and determined solitude. It was Mrs. Weatherby who finally told Ilara the truth one grey December afternoon, as they took tea in the housekeeper's sitting room, the older woman's voice dropping to something reverent and sorrowful as she explained what the household had long understood but never spoke of openly, that the Duke's family had perished in a fire 5 Christmases past, his parents and his beloved sister Charlotte consumed by flames that had torn through their country estate, while Adrian had been away in London on business matters that seemed utterly meaningless in the face of such catastrophic loss, and he had returned to find everything he loved reduced to ash and ruin, his survival a burden of guilt that had shaped every day since. He blamed himself, Mrs. Weatherby confided quietly, for not being there, for choosing business over family on what would prove to be their last Christmas together, and he had spent every holiday since then working obsessively, surrounding himself with ledgers and correspondence, as though the sheer volume of tasks might shield him from the memories that haunted him most fiercely during the season meant for joy and family gatherings. Understanding flooded through Ilara with the force of revelation, recontextualizing everything she had observed about the Duke. His isolation was not coldness, but grief, armor, his relentless work, not ambition but desperate flight from pain too large to face, his careful distance from human connection, a protection against the possibility of losing anyone else he might come to care for, and her heart ached for him with an intensity that surprised her. This man who had bought her freedom, but could not grant himself the same release from his self-imposed prison. On Christmas Eve she found him exactly where she expected, alone in his study with the door closed against the modest festivities the household had arranged, surrounded by ledgers and papers that formed barriers between himself and the world, and the lamplight cast shadows across his face that made him look older than his years, weary with an exhaustion that went deeper than lack of sleep. She stood in the doorway for a long moment, gathering her courage, then spoke his name softly, and when he looked up with surprise and something that might have been relief, she extended an invitation that felt both impulsive and necessary. Would he come see what the winter garden had become, what they had created together from abandonment and care? He hesitated, his gaze moving between her face and the papers on his desk, as though weighing the relative safety of each option. But then he rose with a careful deliberateness that suggested he was acting against his own better judgment, following her through the quiet house to the glass-walled sanctuary they had restored together, and when he stepped inside the conservatory, his breath caught audibly at the transformation that awaited him. The space glowed with carefully tended life, modest but genuinely beautiful, green things flourishing where death had reigned, and the lamplight Ilara had arranged reflected off the glass walls to create an atmosphere both intimate and magical, evidence that patient care could resurrect what had seemed irretrievably lost, and she watched his face as visible emotion broke through his careful control for the first time. Tears gathering in his grey eyes as he moved through the garden, touching leaves and petals with trembling fingers, and she understood that he was seeing not just plants but possibility, not just growth but hope, the radical suggestion that life might continue even after devastating loss, that beauty could be cultivated from the ashes of what had burned. Christmas night settled over Ravenscroft House, with a hushed stillness that seemed to hold its breath, and in the winter garden where lamplight reflected off glass walls and snow fell in silent curtains beyond the conservatory's protection, the Duke and Ilara sat together on the worn wooden bench she had restored, surrounded by the green life they had coaxed from abandonment, and the careful distance they had maintained for months dissolved in the intimacy of this moment. As Adrian Blackwell began to speak, truly speak for the first time since she had known him, his voice low and rough with emotion, as he told her the story she had already learned from Mrs. Weatherby, but which took on new dimensions of anguish when spoken in his own words. He described his family with tender precision, His father's quiet dignity, his mother's fierce intelligence, Charlotte's irrepressible joy, and her love for growing things. And he spoke of the fire that had consumed them while he sat in London, congratulating himself on a successful business negotiation, how he had returned to find the country house reduced to blackened ruins and 3 lives extinguished, and the guilt that had settled into his bones like winter cold was palpable in every word as he confessed his belief that he did not deserve happiness while they remained forever lost, that his survival was a cosmic injustice he could neither understand nor accept, that every moment of pleasure felt like betrayal of their memory, and Ilara listened without judgment or platitude, understanding with painful clarity the prison he had built from grief and self-recrimination, recognizing in his isolation an echo of her own attempts to protect herself from further harm. When his words finally ceased, silence stretched between them, weighted with all that had been revealed. And then she began to share her own story, not the surface facts of the auctions and sales that had defined her recent years, but the deeper shame that lived beneath those events, the complex love she had felt for a father who failed her so catastrophically, the loss of identity that came from being reduced to property traded for debts, the fundamental question of whether she could ever be whole again or would remain forever fractured by what had been done to her. And she spoke of the rage she had buried beneath resignation, the grief for the life she might have lived if circumstances had been different, the fear that she was somehow complicit in her own degradation simply by surviving it. "We are both ghosts," she observed quietly when her confession was complete, the truth settling between them like snow, haunting our own lives instead of living them. The observation hung in the air of the conservatory, fragile and profound, and she saw recognition flash across his face, understanding that they had each chosen a different form of death, his through relentless work and isolation, hers through surrender to circumstance, and that perhaps together they might find their way back to something resembling life. He reached for her hand, the gesture tentative and uncertain, then stopped himself with visible effort, as propriety and fear warred with desire. But she watched the struggle play across his features and made her own choice, closing the small distance between them to take his hand in hers, and the first intentional touch between them carried the weight of everything unspoken, warm skin against warm skin, human connection offered and accepted. "You are more alive than anyone I have known," he said softly, his grey eyes holding hers with an intensity that made her breath catch, and the compliment felt like absolution, like permission to be more than the sum of what had been done to her. And in that moment charged with possibility neither of them could yet name, they sat together in the garden they had restored from death, 2 broken people beginning to believe they might help each other heal, while snow continued to fall beyond the glass walls and the new year waited to be born. January brought new rhythms to Ravenscroft House, subtle transformations that the household staff observed with quiet approval and carefully concealed smiles, for the Duke, who had spent years moving through his own home like a spectre, began to emerge from the isolation that had defined him since his family's death, joining Ilara for dinners in the small dining room rather than taking solitary meals in his study, walking the estate grounds with her on cold afternoons when pale winter sun broke through London's perpetual grey, their conversations deepening with each passing day as they moved beyond the careful formality that had characterized their earlier exchanges into something more genuine and unguarded. He spoke of his architectural passions with an enthusiasm she had never heard from him before, revealing designs he had sketched for reforming London's slums, visions of housing that would offer dignity and safety to those trapped in poverty. And she recognized in these plans an attempt to create meaning from his survival, to honor his family's memory through purposeful action rather than mere grief. And she listened with genuine interest that surprised them both, offering observations that showed her understanding of the human dimensions of his technical solutions. She in turn began to share the secret writings she had composed since childhood, poems that had sustained her through the darkest periods of her life, verses that captured both anguish and beauty in language that revealed the education and sensibility she had been forced to suppress during her years of servitude. And when he read her words, his grey eyes filled with something she was learning to recognize as admiration, a respect that had nothing to do with the circumstances that had brought her to his house, and everything to do with who she actually was beneath the role circumstance had forced upon her. Each revelation drew them closer, building intimacy through accumulated trust rather than dramatic gestures, and the Duke began to smile rare, genuine expressions that transformed his severe aristocratic features into something younger and more vulnerable, and warmth breaking through the careful control he had maintained for so long. And Ilara found herself watching for these moments, treasured glimpses of the man he might have been before grief carved away his capacity for joy, and she understood with growing clarity that she was falling in love with him, that the gratitude she felt for her rescue had evolved into something deeper and more complicated, desire mingling with affection, a partnership blending with passion in ways that both thrilled and terrified her. The awareness grew between them that this strange arrangement had become something neither had planned, something that defied the inherent inequality of their circumstances and yet felt more real than any conventional courtship. But with that awareness came internal conflict that neither could fully escape. Ilara remained technically his property, despite his insistence otherwise, the legal papers still binding her to his household, and she grappled with the question of whether her feelings were truly her own or somehow coerced by circumstance, whether she could trust her own heart after being owned 3 times and sold like livestock, while Adrian wrestled with the question of whether he deserved to feel again after surviving when his family had perished, whether loving her would be selfish appropriation of someone vulnerable or genuine connection between equals. The tension built through accumulated glances that lingered too long, near touches that stopped just short of contact, conversations that stretched until dawn broke over London, and neither could remember when they had last thought to maintain proper distance, and the household watched this careful dance with sympathy and hope, recognizing that 2 broken people were slowly finding their way toward wholeness through each other, though neither yet possessed the courage to name what was growing between them or claim what they both increasingly wanted. February arrived with bitter cold that froze the Thames and turned London's streets to treacherous ice, and on a grey morning when frost patterns decorated the windows of Ravenscroft House like delicate lace, a letter arrived that shattered the fragile peace Ilara and Adrian had constructed over the past months, delivered by a grim-faced solicitor whose presence alone suggested trouble before he ever opened his leather case to present the documents that would change everything. Ilara was summoned to the Duke's study, where she found him standing rigid before his desk, the letter clutched in one hand, while the other braced against the mahogany surface, as if he needed physical support to remain upright, and the expression on his face, cold fury mingled with something darker, something almost like fear sent ice through her veins before she even knew what news the pages contained. Her father was dead, liver failure from years of drink, finally claiming him in a shabby boarding house, where he had lived his final months in solitary degradation. But death had not ended his capacity to harm her, for in his last days he had sold her contract of service one final time to a London brothel keeper named Grimshaw, who now demanded the Duke surrender her or face legal action to enforce the claim. The words seemed to come from very far away, as Adrian explained in a voice carefully controlled but vibrating with rage, the legal particulars washing over her in waves that left her numb and cold, because the fundamental truth was brutally simple. Her father had sold her future services before his death. The transaction was legally binding, and she was not free and never had been despite everything she had allowed herself to hope during these months at Ravenscroft House. Devastation crashed over her like a physical blow, stealing her breath and her capacity for coherent thought. Because she had begun to believe in the possibility of a different life, had allowed herself to imagine a future where she belonged to no one but herself, where her growing love for Adrian might be met and returned without the shadow of obligation darkening everything, and now that fragile hope lay in ruins around her feet like shattered glass. The Duke's cold fury burned through his careful aristocratic control as he stated with absolute certainty, "I will not allow it," his grey eyes blazing with protective rage that would have warmed her if she had not known the futility of his declaration, because the law cared nothing for his wealth or title or intentions. The law recognized only the validity of contracts and the rights of creditors to collect what was owed them, and Grimshaw's claim was technically valid no matter how morally repugnant. She prepared to flee, the instinct immediate and overwhelming, because she would run into the frozen streets with nothing rather than go willingly to the fate her father had sold her into, would disappear into London's anonymous masses and take her chances with starvation and exposure rather than submit to becoming property once more, especially property of the sort Grimshaw intended to make of her. But Adrian caught her arm as she turned toward the door, and the touch stopped her, because even in extremity, she could not ignore the connection between them. He revealed his plan with the decisive certainty of a man accustomed to solving problems through application of resources. He would buy out the contract at whatever price Grimshaw demanded, then legally free her with documents that could never be challenged or overturned. Permanent freedom recorded in courts of law and witnessed by solicitors, so that no future creditor could ever claim her again. "You owe me nothing," she protested through the tears that had begun to fall despite her attempts at control, because the cost of such a transaction would be astronomical, and she could not bear to be the source of his financial ruin, even as she understood the terrible irony that she was objecting to being purchased yet again. But his response cut through her protests with quiet intensity. "I know," he said, holding her gaze with his own. "This is not about debt." The unspoken confession lived in those words, in the way he looked at her, as if she were infinitely precious, rather than merely property to be transferred. And she understood that he was offering her not just freedom from Grimshaw, but freedom absolute, liberty to leave his house and his life if she chose, and the realization that he would sacrifice his fortune to give her that choice, even knowing she might use it to walk away forever, was the truest declaration of love he could have made, and more profound than any words, because it honored her autonomy above his own desires. And in that moment, her heart broke and mended simultaneously, as she recognized the depth of feeling behind his careful formality, the love he had not yet spoken aloud, but which manifested in this willingness to bankrupt himself for her freedom. The negotiation with Grimshaw took place in the Duke's study 3 days after the letter's arrival, and Elara positioned herself in the adjacent library, where she could hear every word through the partially open door, unable to bear the uncertainty of waiting elsewhere, while her fate was bartered like merchandise in a market. And she listened as the brothel keeper, a man whose voice carried the oily quality of someone who enjoyed having power over the desperate, laid out his terms with calculating precision, demanding a sum so astronomical that Elara's breath caught in her throat, because she understood immediately that no reasonable person would pay such an amount for a single servant's contract. But Adrian's response came without hesitation, his aristocratic voice cold and utterly controlled as he stated simply, "Agreed," and then added with the decisiveness of someone accustomed to shaping negotiations to his will, with the following conditions. Legal documents guaranteeing Miss Ashworth's permanent freedom, witnessed by 3 independent solicitors, recorded officially in both ecclesiastical and civil courts, with copies lodged at the Court of Chancery, so that no future creditor can ever claim her services or person under any pretext whatsoever. Grimshaw's surprise was audible even through the door, clearly not having expected such thoroughness, but greed overcame his suspicion, and he agreed to the terms with barely concealed satisfaction at having extracted such wealth from a duke's protective instincts, and the meeting concluded with arrangements for the formal transfer to take place within the week, once all documents were properly prepared and witnessed. Elara retreated to her room before Adrian could discover her eavesdropping, her mind reeling from what she had heard, and it was only later that evening when Mrs. Weatherby came to her with tea and an expression of mingled sadness and approval that she learned the full cost of her freedom. The Duke was selling Thornfield Park, one of his family's smaller estates in Kent, a property that had been in the Blackwell family for generations and which held particular sentimental value because his sister had loved it and had planned someday to make it her own home. The sacrifice stunned Elara into silence, because she understood that Adrian was divesting himself not merely of money but of memory, selling a piece of his family's history to purchase her liberation, and the magnitude of that choice. What it said about how he valued her freedom above his own heritage left her trembling with emotions she could not fully name. On the evening, the transaction was completed. Adrian summoned her to his study, where he presented her with the freedom papers, illegal documents bearing official seals and the signatures of witnesses, permanent and irrevocable proof that she belonged to no one, and his grey eyes held hers with an intensity that made her heart race as he said quietly, "You are no one's property, Miss Ashworth, not even mine, especially not mine." And the emphasis on those final words carried a weight of meaning that transcended the legal formalities, a declaration that he released any claim not just to her service but to her person, her future, her choices. The moment she had dreamed of for years had finally arrived. She held her freedom in her hands, tangible and legally binding, yet it felt strangely incomplete, hollow in ways she had not anticipated, because freedom meant she could leave, could walk away from Ravenscroft House and never look back, could begin a new life anywhere in England or beyond with the funds he had promised to provide, and the realization that she didn't want to leave, that the thought of departing filled her with anguish rather than relief, crashed over her with the force of revelation, and she stood there holding the papers that granted her liberty, while understanding with painful clarity that her heart was no longer her own to command, that somewhere in the past months she had given it to the haunted Duke who had purchased her freedom at such tremendous cost, and the confusion at her own heart, the question of whether she could trust these feelings or whether they were merely gratitude, dressed in love's clothing, left her speechless and struggling against tears she would not let fall in his presence. With freedom came uncertainty that settled over Ravenscroft House like a fog, thicker and more impenetrable than the London mists beyond the estate's walls, and in the days following the presentation of her freedom papers, Ilara discovered that liberation brought its own peculiar form of suffering, as Adrian retreated into a formality more rigid than any he had maintained, even in their earliest days, as if releasing her legally meant he must also release her emotionally, withdraw into careful distance to ensure she never felt obligated by gratitude or circumstance to remain where she might not truly wish to be. He offered her choices with the careful neutrality of a solicitor, presenting options to a client. "You may stay as long as you wish. Miss Ashworth," he said one morning over breakfast that felt suddenly formal despite months of growing ease between them, "or I can arrange passage anywhere you desire, funds for establishment, wherever you choose to settle, letters of recommendation that will open doors, connections to respectable families in Bath or Edinburgh, or even abroad if you prefer a complete fresh start. Anything you need to build the life you deserve now, that you are truly free to choose it." His careful distance wounded her more than she had anticipated, cutting deeper than Grimshaw's threats or even her father's final betrayal, because she recognized in Adrian's studied politeness an act of sacrifice, understood that he was protecting her from any hint of obligation or coercion, even as the effort cost him visible pain that showed in the shadows beneath his eyes and the tension in his shoulders, and she realized with aching clarity that he would rather endure his own suffering than risk making her feel trapped by circumstance or gratitude into remaining somewhere she did not freely choose to be. But she didn't want protection, didn't want the careful distance he maintained like a wall between them, didn't want to be spared from a choice she longed to make, if only he would allow her close enough to make it. And the realization that she wanted him, not his house or his wealth or his protection, but him, the haunted man who had somehow become necessary to her happiness, left her struggling with internal turmoil that kept her wakeful through long February nights, grappling with questions that had no easy answers, because how could she trust her own heart after being owned 3 times? After years of having her choices stolen and her autonomy traded like currency in transactions she could not control. The question tormented her. Was this love or merely gratitude, dressed in love's clothing, the natural attachment of someone rescued to her rescuer, or was it something real and separate from the circumstances that had brought them together? And could she ever be certain enough to risk confession when uncertainty might bind her to another choice she would come to regret? She watched him return to the isolation he had inhabited before she came to know him, observed as he withdrew from the shared dinners and garden walks and midnight conversations that had become the rhythm of their days, saw him disappear into his study for hours that stretched into full days where she glimpsed him only in passing, always formal, always careful, always maintaining the distance he believed she needed, and the progress they had made through winter seemed to erase itself, like words written in sand before an incoming tide. Mrs. Weatherby observed the growing distance with knowing sadness, remarking one afternoon as she found Ilara alone in the library, where she and Adrian had once shared books and marginalia, 2 fools afraid to reach for what they want. The housekeeper's assessment delivered with unusual bluntness born of affection for them both, each trying to spare the other when all they accomplish is making themselves miserable. And though Ilara could not argue with the observation, she also could not see how to bridge the chasm that had opened between them, when every instinct told her that Adrian's retreat was itself a gift, his way of ensuring she truly possessed the freedom he had purchased for her at such tremendous cost. Spring approached with its promise of renewal, crocuses pushing through the last of winter's snow and light lingering longer each evening, but the season's hope seemed to mock the distance growing between them, as each day carried them further from the fragile intimacy they had built and closer to some inevitable separation that neither wanted but both seemed powerless to prevent. Two people trying so desperately to spare each other that they succeeded only in causing the very pain they hoped to avoid, trapped in a prison of their own construction, where the bars were made of careful consideration and protective distance rather than iron or law. March brought Ilara's decision like winter's final cruelty, a resolution born of desperation and the unbearable pain of remaining in proximity to what she could not have, and she spent a sleepless night composing the words she would use to inform Adrian of her departure, practicing a speech that would sound grateful without revealing the heartbreak beneath her carefully constructed reasons for leaving, because she had decided that she would go to Bath, perhaps, or Edinburgh, somewhere far enough from London that she would not torture herself with proximity to Ravenscroft House and the man who inhabited it, somewhere she could build a new life using the funds and letters of recommendation he had promised, start fresh in a place where no one knew her history, and she could reinvent herself as simply Ilara Ashworth, a woman of modest, independent means, rather than someone who had been sold 3 times and freed by a duke's unprecedented sacrifice. She informed him formally one grey morning in his study, standing before his desk with her hands clasped to still their trembling, as she delivered her prepared speech, thanking him for everything he had done, expressing gratitude for the freedom and opportunities he had provided, explaining with what she hoped was convincing calm that she felt it was time to establish herself independently now that she possessed the means to do so, and his response came after a pause that seemed to stretch into eternity, his grey eyes searching her face for something she could not name, before he said with devastating control, "Of course, I'll arrange everything," his aristocratic composure perfect, except for the slight tension in his jaw that she had learned to recognize as a sign of suppressed emotion, and she thought she detected not relief but something closer to resignation in his acceptance, as if he had been expecting this inevitability and had already armored himself against it. Preparations began with efficient speed, Adrian throwing himself into the logistics of her departure with the same meticulous attention he brought to his architectural projects, arranging letters of introduction to respectable families in Bath, setting up financial accounts that would ensure her comfort, even going so far as to have Mrs. Weatherby help her select appropriate clothing for her new independent status. And through it all he maintained that careful distance, never asking her to reconsider, never suggesting that her departure caused him anything but the mild regret one might feel at the loss of pleasant company, and Ilara told herself she was grateful for his restraint, even as each courteous gesture felt like another small death of hope she had not realized she still harbored. Her final evening at Ravenscroft House arrived with the first true warmth of spring, apple blossoms opening in the estate's orchards and the air carrying the promise of renewal that mocked her internal desolation, and she had planned to spend these last hours in her room, avoiding the painful formality of prolonged farewells. But some impulse she could not resist drew her to the winter garden one final time, wanting to see the place where she and Adrian had worked together to restore life from death, where they had shared their grief and found momentary solace in collaborative purpose, and when she pushed open the conservatory door, she discovered him there, standing alone among the blooms and growth they had nurtured together, surrounded by the tangible evidence of what they could create when they worked as one. And he looked utterly broken, his aristocratic composure shattered, his shoulders bowed as if under unbearable weight, and the raw pain visible in every line of his body stopped her breath because she had never seen him so completely unguarded, so devastated, and before she could retreat or announce her presence, the truth spilled from him in words that sounded torn from some deep place of suffering. "I have loved her for months, perhaps from that first midnight conversation in the library, but I cannot ask her to stay because she has only just gained her freedom, and to confess these feelings would be another form of imprisonment, another man placing chains upon her when she deserves to fly unfettered into whatever future she chooses for herself." The confession, spoken to the empty air as if he were arguing with his own conscience, shattered every careful barrier Elara had constructed around her heart, and tears she had refused to shed throughout all the preparations now fell freely as she stepped forward into the conservatory's warmth and said through the thickness in her throat, "You foolish man, did you think I planned to leave because I felt nothing?" Adrian turned at the sound of her voice, his grey eyes widening with shock and something that looked terribly like hope warring with disbelief. And Elara stepped fully into the conservatory's warmth, into the space they had created together, from death and abandonment, and the dam that had held back her truth for weeks broke completely as she said with trembling certainty, "I am not leaving because I feel nothing, you impossible, self-sacrificing fool. I am leaving because I feel everything, because staying near you while believing you wanted only to be free of obligation was agony, because every careful courtesy you offered felt like another small death of hope I had no right to harbor." And the confession spilled from her like water too long contained, unstoppable now that the first words had escaped. "How can you be certain?" he asked, and his voice held such raw vulnerability that it stripped away every vestige of the aristocratic composure he usually wore like armor. And she could see the fear naked in his expression, the terror that she might be confusing gratitude with genuine affection, comfort with love. And he voiced what had clearly haunted him through all the weeks of careful distance. "How do you know this isn't simply security, safety, the first true kindness you have known after years of cruelty? How can you be sure that what you feel is real love, rather than the natural attachment of someone rescued to her rescuer?" The question deserved an answer as honest as his confession had been, and Elara moved closer, drawn by the need to make him understand what had taken her weeks to comprehend herself. And she said with a clarity born of hard-won self-knowledge, "Because I am terrified, Adrian, because I could leave tomorrow with your blessing and your money and your letters of recommendation, could start any life I choose in Bath or Edinburgh or anywhere in the world where no one knows my history, could build a new existence as an independent woman of modest means, could have security and respect and freedom from the past. And yet, the only life I want is one where I choose you every day, where I wake in this house not because I have nowhere else to go, but because this is where my heart has taken root, despite every rational reason it should not have done so." She watched understanding begin to dawn in his eyes, saw hope kindle alongside the fear, and she pressed on because he needed to hear all of it, needed to understand the full truth of what she offered. "If this were gratitude, I would feel obligated to stay, would feel that leaving would be ungrateful or wrong, but what I feel is choice, Adrian. The terrifying freedom of choosing you not because you saved me but because you saw me, not because you provided comfort, but because you showed me your own broken places and trusted me with your grief, not because you were kind but because your particular brand of haunted solitude speaks to something in my own soul that recognizes its mirror." The tears that had threatened throughout her speech finally fell, and she let them come unchecked because they were part of the truth she offered him, evidence of how much this mattered, how much he mattered. And she said softly, "I have been owned 3 times, have had my choices stolen and my autonomy bartered, and I know the difference between obligation and desire, between what is forced and what is freely chosen, and I am choosing you. If you will have me, if you can believe that this choice is real and separate from everything that came before." He reached for her, then stopped himself even now, still seeking permission even in this moment of confession, still so careful not to impose himself upon her freedom, and the gesture broke something in Elara's chest, even as it confirmed everything she loved about him. This man who would deny himself rather than risk making her feel trapped. And so she closed the distance herself, crossed the final space between them, and kissed him with all the courage of someone who had learned through suffering that freedom meant not fleeing from feeling, but choosing it deliberately, embracing it fully, despite the risk of pain or loss. The kiss tasted of salt from her tears and the sweet fragrance of the flowers they had grown together, tasted of winter gardens and second chances, of grief transformed into hope and isolation broken by genuine connection. And when they finally drew apart enough to breathe, Adrian's hands came up to frame her face with a gentleness that made her want to weep again, and he said against her hair with wonder threading through his voice, "I love you, Elara, God help me. I love you so completely that the thought of letting you go was killing me by inches, but I could not bear to be another man who took your choices from you, I could not live with myself if you stayed out of anything less than absolute freedom to choose. And she felt his whole body trembling with the force of emotions too long suppressed, felt him holding her as if she were something infinitely precious and fragile that might disappear if he did not anchor her with touch. Spring transformed Ravenscroft House with a completeness that went beyond the seasonal blooming of gardens and the lengthening of days. For the transformation was spiritual as much as temporal, a fundamental shift in the atmosphere of a place that had been a mausoleum of grief and now became a home animated by cautious joy and the tentative exploration of what it meant to love freely after both parties had believed themselves and beyond such possibility. Adrian and Ilara navigated their new relationship with deliberate care, understanding that the foundation they built now would determine everything that followed, and so despite living under the same roof, they courted properly, with all the formality and consideration that society would expect of any respectable couple, taking chaperoned walks through the estate grounds where apple blossoms drifted like snow, and the air carried the promise of renewal, sitting together in the library with Mrs. Weatherby knitting pointedly nearby, as they discussed literature and philosophy with the added dimension of acknowledged affection, coloring every exchange, learning each other not as rescuer and rescued or master and freed servant, but as two individuals choosing to build something together on the solid ground of equality, rather than the shifting sand of transaction or obligation. He shared with her his architectural dreams in their full scope, spreading drawings across the library table and explaining his vision for reforming London's most desperate slums, creating housing that would preserve human dignity rather than warehouse the poor like livestock, and she listened with genuine interest that evolved into active partnership as she began offering insights drawn from her own experience of poverty and powerlessness, understanding in ways his privileged upbringing never could what it meant to live without agency or hope, and together they refined his designs until they became truly revolutionary, practical plans that addressed not just shelter but community, not just survival but the possibility of thriving. Their collaboration extended beyond romance into shared purpose, each discovering in the other not just a beloved but a true partner whose strengths complemented their own weaknesses, whose vision aligned with their deepest values, and the household staff who had served a ghost for 5 years now served a man truly alive again, and they whispered among themselves with satisfaction about the transformation they had witnessed, how the Duke smiled now, how he laughed at Miss Ashworth's dry observations, how he seemed to stand taller, as if some burden had been lifted from his shoulders. He taught her to ride, taking her out on gentle horses through the estate's parkland, and watching with undisguised delight as she discovered the freedom of movement and speed, the joy of mastering a new skill without fear of punishment for failure, and she taught him to laugh freely, to find humor in small absurdities, to allow himself moments of pure pleasure without the crushing guilt that had shadowed his every attempt at happiness since the fire that took his family. Proper society whispered, of course, because proper society always whispered, and the gossip that reached them through various channels spoke of the Duke of Ravenscroft courting his former, and here the gossip stumbled, uncertain what term to use for a woman who had been legally his property before he freed her, the ambiguity of the situation providing fodder for speculation both salacious and cruel, and the whispers troubled them both, though for different reasons. Adrian furious on Ilara's behalf that anyone would diminish her or question her worth, Ilara terrified that the scandal might damage his standing in ways that would eventually breed resentment between them. It was in June, as summer settled warm and golden over London, that he proposed marriage formally and publicly, wanting no question of legitimacy or hint that their union was anything less than a deliberate choice by two people of equal standing. And he did so not in some private moment, but at a small dinner party he hosted specifically for the purpose, inviting several influential members of society whose approval would matter, and before them all he took Ilara's hand and asked with quiet dignity whether she would do him the honor of becoming his wife, and she accepted with tears in her eyes, and the understanding blazing clear in her heart that this choice, like her love, was entirely her own, freely made, without coercion or obligation, the exercise of autonomy she had fought so hard to reclaim. The engagement was celebrated quietly but genuinely, without the elaborate fanfare that might have attended a more conventional aristocratic betrothal, but with sincere joy from those who truly cared for them, Mrs. Weatherby weeping happily into her handkerchief, and the household staff raising glasses in the servants' hall to toast the unlikely romance that had brought life back to Ravenscroft House. And as spring yielded to summer and their wedding day approached, both Adrian and Ilara felt the profound rightness of their journey. How every painful step had been necessary to bring them to this moment of chosen love, this deliberate commitment, built on genuine knowledge of each other's broken places and conscious decision to build something whole together from their individual fragments. The London season brought challenges that neither Adrian nor Ilara had fully anticipated, for while their private happiness had insulated them somewhat from the harsh judgments of society, the Duke insisted on introducing Ilara properly despite her lack of conventional background, determined that she should take her rightful place as his betrothed, rather than remain hidden away as if he were ashamed of their unconventional beginning, and so they attended balls and soirees and dinner parties where the cream of aristocratic society gathered to see and be seen, to judge and gossip and maintain the rigid hierarchies that governed their world. Society matrons whispered viciously about the circumstances of their meeting, the story having spread through drawing rooms and private clubs with the speed that scandal always travels, embellished and distorted until some versions bore little resemblance to truth, and Ilara felt their eyes upon her like physical weight, assessing her gown and her manners, and finding both somehow wanting despite Adrian's patient coaching and Mrs. Weatherby's careful preparation, for there was something in her bearing that marked her as different, a certain directness, born of suffering that made the other women uncomfortable in ways they could not quite articulate. At her first ball, a glittering affair at the Duchess of Pemberton's townhouse, where crystal chandeliers cast dancing light across polished floors, and the air hung heavy with perfume and barely concealed malice, she overheard cruel speculation from a cluster of young matrons who had not noticed her standing just beyond the potted palms, their voices carrying clearly, as one said with poisonous sweetness, "Bought her like livestock at some sordid auction, and now plays pretend she's his equal, as if putting her in silk could erase what she is, what she's been." And another laughed and added, "One wonders what particular services she provided to inspire such devotion, for surely no respectable connection could arise from such degrading origins." The words cut deeply, awakening old shame that Ilara had thought conquered, the visceral memory of standing on an auction block while men assessed her value flooding back with nauseating clarity, and she fled to the terrace, where cool night air provided escape from the suffocating ballroom, and she seriously considered for the first time breaking the engagement to spare Adrian the social ruin that seemed inevitable, for how could his standing survive this constant erosion of respect? This transformation in society's eyes, from the distinguished Duke of Ravenscroft to the fool who had elevated his former property to a position she could never truly fill. When she confessed her doubts to Adrian that evening in the carriage ride home, expecting perhaps relief that she had offered him an escape from the scandal, his fierce response stunned her with its vehemence as he took her hands and said with barely controlled fury, "Let them talk. Let the whole of London condemn us and whisper behind their fans and exclude us from their petty gatherings, for I would rather have one true moment with you than a lifetime of their hollow approval, would rather be cast out entirely from their circles than pretend for one instant that you are anything less than my equal in every way that matters, would rather burn every social bridge I possess than allow their cruelty to diminish what we have built together." His public declaration came at the next gathering they attended, a musicale at Lord Hartley's residence, where the whispers had grown so bold that several guests openly stared, and Adrian stood before the assembled company during the interval and said with quiet dignity that carried to every corner of the room, "Miss Ashworth has shown more courage and grace in the face of circumstances that would have broken most people than anyone in this room has demonstrated in lives of ease and privilege, and I am honored beyond measure that she has chosen to accept my proposal of marriage, honored that she sees something in me worth choosing, despite having every reason to mistrust the motives of men in general and aristocrats in particular." The shocked silence that followed held for several heartbeats before scattered applause began, tentative at first, then growing stronger, led by several unexpected allies, including the elderly Countess of Westmore, who had known Adrian's mother, and who declared in her carrying voice that anyone with eyes could see the Duke had never been happier, and that love freely chosen was worth more than a dozen proper arrangements born of duty and advantage, and while not everyone joined the applause, and many continued to whisper disapproval, the open condemnation fractured somewhat, creating space for their relationship to exist, if not with full acceptance, then at least without unanimous censure. And Ilara understood in that moment that Adrian's love included this willingness to fight for her publicly, to risk everything he had been born to, rather than allow society's judgment to poison what they had grown together from seeds of mutual understanding and deliberate choice. June arrived with the softness of a promise kept, bringing warm sunshine that gilded the gardens of Ravenscroft House in honey light and coaxed the roses into extravagant bloom. And it was in this season of abundance that Adrian and Ilara chose to marry, selecting a date that held no significance beyond their mutual preference for simplicity and their shared desire to begin their lives as husband and wife without unnecessary delay, the wedding planned as an intimate gathering rather than the grand society spectacle that the Duke's position might have warranted. For both understood that the meaning of their union lay not in elaborate display, but in the sacred truth of vows spoken freely between two people who had earned their happiness through suffering and patience and the courage to choose love, despite every reason to mistrust it. The ceremony took place in the garden. Ilara had begun restoring that first winter, the conservatory's glass walls thrown open to admit the June air and the natural beauty of flowering plants that had grown under her care, from bare soil to verdant life. The small gathering of guests, including only those who had shown genuine support for their unconventional romance. Mrs. Weatherby seated in the front row with tears already streaming down her weathered face, the household staff arranged with quiet dignity along the periphery, and the elderly Countess of Westmore, who had defended them so publicly, now watching with satisfied approval, as if she had personally orchestrated this happy conclusion. Ilara wore simple elegance, a gown of cream silk without excessive ornamentation, its beauty derived from perfect fit and quality of fabric rather than fashionable embellishment, and she carried flowers cut that morning from the winter conservatory, the blooms they had nurtured together during those early tentative weeks, when neither had dared name the feeling growing between them. And when Adrian turned to watch her walk toward him, his expression held such unguarded joy that several guests found themselves unexpectedly moved, understanding in that moment that they were witnessing something rare, a marriage begun not from duty or advantage, but from genuine choice and hard-won love. The ceremony itself felt sacred not because of religious tradition or social ritual, but because of the profound truth being acknowledged. The vicar's words almost secondary to the moment when Adrian and Ilara faced each other and spoke vows they had written themselves, he promising to honor her freedom always, to never take for granted the gift of her trust, to choose her daily with the same deliberation she had shown in choosing him, and she promising to choose him every morning, to build their life together as equal partners, to remember that love freely given was the only kind worth having. And as they exchanged rings and sealed their promises with a kiss that tasted of relief and joy, and the knowledge that they had found each other against impossible odds, the small gathering erupted in genuine applause. Mrs. Weatherby sobbing openly now, while the Countess dabbed discreetly at her own eyes. The wedding breakfast that followed filled the drawing room with genuine joy rather than the forced gaiety of social performance, conversation flowing easily among people who had gathered not from obligation, but from authentic care. And as afternoon faded toward evening, and the guests gradually departed, Adrian and Ilara found themselves alone at last in the home that had transformed from mausoleum to sanctuary, and they spoke quietly of the journey that had brought them from that rain-soaked auction house to this moment of chosen love, Adrian confessing with wonder still evident in his voice, "I thought I'd lost the capacity for happiness, believed myself broken beyond repair by grief and guilt, but you taught me otherwise. You taught me that healing was possible if one had the courage to accept it." And Ilara's response came softly, her hand finding his in the gathering dusk. "You gave me back myself when I had forgotten who I was, beyond the shame and fear, gave me freedom not just legally but emotionally, the space to discover that I could still choose, still love, still become whole again. And everything else we built together, built as equals, creating something new from our individual brokenness." And that night, their wedding night, was tender and mutual and entirely free of any shadow of transaction or obligation, two people choosing each other completely, claiming the joy they had earned through patience and pain, the consummation of a love that had grown from the darkest soil into something beautiful and true and wholly their own. 2 years passed like a gentle dream, the kind that leaves one changed upon waking, and in that span of time, the Duke and Duchess of Ravenscroft transformed not only their own lives, but began quietly reshaping the social landscape around them, their reformist work becoming known throughout London as Adrian's architectural vision, found concrete expression in housing projects that provided dignified accommodation for the working poor, structures designed with the same attention to beauty and function that characterized his ancestral estate, because he believed passionately that all people deserved spaces that nurtured rather than diminished the human spirit, and Ilara stood beside him as true partner in these endeavors, her own voice finding expression through a collection of poetry published under her own name, verses that spoke with unflinching honesty to themes of resilience and redemption, of finding oneself after being lost, of learning that worthiness was inherent rather than earned, and the volume sold modestly but touched deeply those who read it, particularly women who recognized in her words their own struggles with circumstances that sought to define them. She had reconnected cautiously with distant family members who had abandoned her during her father's decline into gambling and desperation, some relationships mending slowly, as relatives expressed belated shame for their failure to help when she needed them most, offering explanations that ranged from genuine regret to self-serving justification, and while Ilara chose to rebuild bridges with some, she remained at peace with leaving others broken, understanding that forgiveness did not require reconciliation and that she owed nothing to those who had turned away in her darkest hours. This selective restoration of family ties, another expression of the freedom she had learned to exercise with deliberation and care. Adrian had softened in ways that would have seemed impossible to those who had known the cold, isolated Duke of their first meeting, smiling readily now, laughing with genuine warmth, his guilt over surviving his family's tragedy transformed through Ilara's patient influence into purposeful action that honored their memory. The housing projects named discreetly for his lost parents and sister, his architectural designs incorporating elements his sister had loved in gardens, his charitable work, a living memorial more meaningful than any stone monument could ever be. The winter conservatory that had witnessed their first tentative collaboration had expanded into full gardens that sprawled across previously neglected portions of the estate, testament to their shared belief in nurturing beauty from barren soil, in coaxing life from what had seemed dead beyond recovery, and visitors to Ravenscroft House now remarked on the transformation of both grounds and master. The Gothic severity softened by greenery and genuine happiness, the household staff moving through their duties with the satisfaction of people who served not from mere obligation, but from affection for employers who treated them with dignity and fairness. On an autumn evening 2 years after their wedding, as golden light slanted through the conservatory's glass walls and painted everything in honey and amber, Ilara shared with Adrian the news that a child was expected, their joy at this announcement, tempered by the gravity of bringing new life into a world they both understood could be cruel and unforgiving, yet brightened by the knowledge that they would raise this child in love rather than duty, in freedom rather than constraint, teaching through example that transformation was possible, that redemption could be earned, that the circumstances of one's beginning need not dictate the shape of one's ending. And as Adrian placed his hand gently against her still flat stomach and spoke softly of his hopes and fears for their coming son or daughter, Ilara understood that their happiness had been earned through patience and courage, through the willingness to be vulnerable after betrayal, through the daily choice to build something beautiful from the broken pieces of their separate pasts, and that this child would be born into a home where love was freely given and chosen rather than demanded or purchased, a home where both parents understood the price of freedom because they had each paid it in different currencies, and together had learned that the only love worth having was the kind that liberated rather than bound, that elevated rather than diminished, that grew from choice rather than obligation or circumstance. 5 years after that rain-soaked autumn evening, when Ilara had stood on an auction block for the 3rd time, believing herself beyond redemption or hope, she found herself in the winter conservatory of Ravenscroft House on a golden September afternoon, sunlight streaming through glass walls to paint everything in warm amber light, watching her 2 children play among the flowering plants, while Adrian sat nearby at a wrought iron table covered with architectural drawings for his latest housing project. And the scene held such perfect domestic contentment that she sometimes had to pause and breathe deeply to convince herself it was real and not some desperate dream conjured by a broken mind still trapped in servitude. Their daughter, Charlotte, now 3 years old, had inherited her father's grey eyes and her mother's dark hair, and their son, Thomas, barely 18 months, toddled after his sister with determined concentration. And as Elara watched them, she reflected on the impossible journey that had brought her from property sold thrice to woman who had chosen her own destiny, the scars of those years still visible in moments of anxiety when she woke from nightmares of auction houses and grasping hands, but no longer defining her, no longer the totality of her identity, because she had learned through patient years and Adrian's steady love that wholeness was possible even after shattering, that one could be remade without erasing what had been broken. She understood now that her redemption had not come solely from Adrian's intervention on that November night, though his choice to buy her freedom rather than her service had been the catalyst for transformation, but rather her healing had required her own courage, her willingness to trust again after betrayal, her decision to accept love when it was freely offered rather than demanded or purchased, and perhaps most critically, her gradual understanding that she was whole, not because someone had rescued her, but because she had found the strength to save herself, claiming agency even in circumstances designed to strip it away, choosing daily to build rather than surrender to bitterness and despair. Adrian glanced up from his drawings and caught her watching him, and the smile he offered held such uncomplicated joy that her heart contracted with gratitude for this life they had created together, and this family built on foundation of choice rather than obligation, and she thought of all the small moments that had accumulated into happiness, the winter garden they had restored together, the midnight conversations about literature and philosophy, the gradual thawing of two people who had believed themselves beyond repair, and she understood that their love story would never fit the conventional romance pattern because it had been forged in darkness and emerged slowly, painfully, requiring patience and courage, and the willingness to be vulnerable when every instinct screamed for self-protection. Dear listener, perhaps you wonder at the truth of such transformations, whether people truly can heal from circumstances that seem to break them irreparably, whether love can genuinely flourish between two souls, so marked by loss and shame, and the weight of transactions that reduced human worth to monetary value. And I tell you this, we are all shaped by our circumstances, molded by the forces that press upon us. But we are not imprisoned by them unless we choose to be, for there exists within each person a core of resilience that cannot be purchased or sold, and while trauma leaves its marks, it need not write the final chapter of any life. Love freely chosen differs fundamentally from any obligation, carrying with it the weight of deliberate selection, the knowledge that one could walk away but chooses instead to stay, to build, to nurture something fragile and precious into strength. And such love requires patience of a kind our modern world often dismisses, the slow accumulation of small gestures and quiet moments that gradually construct foundation strong enough to bear the weight of two damaged people learning to trust again. Transformation is slow, requiring both the internal work of examining one's own heart and the external willingness to accept genuine care when it is offered. And those facing their own darkness should know that healing does not mean forgetting or erasing what has happened, but rather integrating pain into a larger story where it becomes part of, but not the totality of who you are, and every person deserves the freedom to choose their own story, to claim agency over their narrative, even when circumstance has sought to write them into roles they never chose. May you find the courage to reach for what seems impossible, the patience to build slowly what cannot be rushed, and the wisdom to recognize love that liberates rather than binds when it appears in your life, perhaps in forms you did not expect, from directions you did not anticipate. And may you grant yourself the grace to heal at whatever pace your soul requires, knowing that wholeness is always possible even after shattering, that spring follows winter with the certainty of natural law, and that you are worthy of love freely given, of happiness earned through courage, of a life chosen rather than endured. From Stories for Sleep, may these words bring you comfort and hope as you rest, and may you carry with you the knowledge that transformation is possible, that love can heal what seemed beyond repair, and that every ending holds within it the seed of new beginning. Rest well, dear listener, and when you wake, may you find the strength to choose your own story, to claim your own freedom, to build your own garden from whatever soil you have been given. And in the conservatory of Ravenscroft House, Ilara and Adrian gather their children as afternoon fades into evening. Two people who found each other in darkness and chose to create light, choosing each other still, always. Their love a testament to the enduring truth that we are never beyond redemption, never too broken to heal, never too lost to find our way home.